Hi there, students. So, some of you have asked me whether I can go and do an extra class on the felt assessments that is due not only for the sake of my senior students in the second year, but those in the wall course as well, or doing the experiential learning year. But I think I'm going to make a couple of videos, let's say 2 or 3 or 4, just for the sake of me being able to manage it more properly. I'm not going to do a vegetation community classification video just yet. I think the majority of you are adept at actually doing that. And please do remember the relevance of a vegetation community classification. This is one of those foundations of our felt assessment. I mean, we need to know exactly what we've got and where we've got it and how much we've got with regards to hectares or surface area covered by a specific unit, vegetation unit, community, homogeneous unit, whatever you want to call it. So, as per this example, thanks Amber Olivier, this is from your classification that you did this year. You guys can obviously see that this is a resultant map of a vegetation community classification. It's not the stratification. That is only a phase within the methodology of classifying the homogeneous units. This is the actual resultant community map. This one specifically is of magic forest, so you can see that there's an indication of nuances within the vegetation. In this case, Amber went and she said, well, it's a bunch of sub-communities of just the normal Swartland, Sheller and Oosterveld. It might be the case, it might not be the case. Some of it is transformed and can be seen as a community on its own. Well, in any case, this is going to show you what you have and where does it occur. So with this, obviously, we want surface area covered for each one of these homogeneous units as well. And why is that relevant? Because when we go and determine stocking as an example, or carrying capacities as an example, we want to basically work off of averages or means. Do we use a mean for the whole reserve? You can if you really want to. Is it going to distort the accuracy of the data? It might, especially if you've got a reduced sample size. If you only have 1 or 2 communities and you take that for being a 50-50 split and the one is 90% more prevalent than the other one, then you're going to get a distorted mean. So in other words, rather always work towards a mean for a unit instead of the whole farm, even though you can go and stock in accordance to a specified value of the whole farm at the end of the day if you combine all of it together. But needless to say, let's rather work towards these specific units and not just the farm as a whole. So what all of this is going to basically be comprised out of is, what do we do after we have the classified map now? So with regards to the assessment of, I'm not going to include anything with regards to the assessment of cases of types of erosion or severity of erosion, of the presence of alien invasives, even and that's alien invasive plants, even though you can deduct information off of these types of assessments that we are going to do. Instead, we are going to look at everything from vegetation condition assessments. We're going to look at, and that is specifically for the grazing component. Then we're also going to look at, and this is with regards to the browsing component, the browsable volume that is located within your farm or that is available for those browsing species to consume as foliage. We are not going to do the biomass for the graze, even though that can also be used obviously to give a lot of information with regards to the general assessment and monitoring of the vegetation, and more specifically towards the monitoring of production as an example. And this gives indication of the success of, let's say, restoration practices, and even when to go and burn as an example, and whether you can go and increase the stocking capacity, or rather the carrying capacity, the economical carrying capacity of, as an instance now, the grazing capacity, well, the grazing component rather. Then we're also going to look at, like I said, the carrying capacities. That's the ecological carrying capacity. We're going to try and determine that using a specific method, and please do remember there's quite a few methods. I'm also not going to mention the authors of these specific methods, as we have adopted and modified some extent to these methodologies, but that is for you to go and research during your lit review, and that's your literature reviewing obviously, of these types of methods that you can use and why you choose a specific one. Now, why do I show you this specific one? And that is, it's the most generalized one within, let's say, South Africa. And that is a process of, or the method of getting to all of these results that we want to get to. It's also quite decently noted within textbooks, even though the calculation thereof is not always as accurate or as in-depth as we would like it to be. You can actually go and view it within books that you most probably already have. In this case, it would be Veld Management, Principles and Practices of Fritz van Oudtshoorn. There's Afrikaans version obviously of this as well. And then we've got our normal old game ranch management, the 6th edition of JP Botma and the Toy, that you can go and view. Where do we find these things? Maybe in the game ranch management book, page 137, you'll see that there's a bunch of methods or calculations mentioned. And then within the Van Oudtshoorn book, you can page to the 180s, 190s, and you can see that there's a bunch of methodologies mentioned as well. We'll go and look for one or two of those, as those are most widely used. It's also something that we use within the higher education arena as a standard, to ensure that we teach basically the students how to run the due process of these Veld assessments. So are you always going to use these techniques or these methods? No, obviously not. It might not be the case. I mean, we've got so many biomes within just South Africa on its own, and we've got so many variations of vegetation, obviously, within each biome, within each region, as an example. And to be just standardizing all of the methods for the whole lot is obviously going to be incorrect and going to lead to inaccurate and useless data. So let's take it for what it is. Let's run this process. Let's try and master these techniques, and then obviously we know what is needed, what should be expected, and then if we need to go and use any other technique to try and exchange it somewhere, maybe down the specific process standard as an example, with the other technique, and just motivate why you would rather use this technique than the other one. And we're always obviously looking for the best representation of, in this case it might be the veld condition, the amount of biomass available with regards to graze and browse maybe, and then to go and determine ecological carrying capacities and stocking structures. So we're working towards accuracy. If we've got this and we've got a process in place and we've documented this, it's on record, we can obviously subsequently go on an annual or biannual or every 5 years basis, depending on the technique or the assessment that you are doing, and redo this in accordance to the specific process or specified process, and then we can see whether there's any change. And that's basically what we are looking at. It's not necessarily to go and do it once and accept that that is now the correct results. It's exactly what we wanted and needed. Instead, we go and do it on a specific process, we get results, and we have results that we now need to go and be able to replicate in other years of monitoring or assessment. And now we've got a trend of how we can actually go and pick up if there's any beneficial or detrimental change, and whether our input is working or not, whether we've stocked correctly or not, should we adjust or not, so on and so forth. So let's run a specific process. Can you use this on your farm? Yes, most probably. We've got certain ways that we can go and adapt and modify these techniques to be more specific to a certain type of vegetation, even though it's maybe outside the scope of that vegetation, but I'll show you that quickly just now as well. Okay, so I'm assuming that you've got the vegetation community classified on your property. You gave me a map like this that you went and did on something like Cape Farm Mapper. This one was done on Google Earth, most probably Google Earth Pro, which give you a bit of more tools and resources that you can use and play with. And you've got the sizes, obviously, of each one of these as well. And I'll tell you why the sizes is so pertinent later on. So let's go and say, well, what do we first now need to do? Subsequent to this classification, we need to go and determine the condition of the veld. To be more specific, we do an ecological index assessment. This is a type of assessment where we've got a condition score as a result that we use to then either work out means, and then we can obviously go and use the specific resultant values in carrying capacity estimators as well. So the one step follows the other one, follows the other one, follows the other one. So the first one would be to determine the veld condition in accordance to the ecological index method. So what does this entail? I want you guys to make contact with me. Let's quickly just check. It's this one. This is instructions that I gave some of my students that did practical on Cape Nature Reserve here in the Western Cape. You can see where my cursor is, low at CR 2000.co.za. That's my email. And why I give you my email, if you've got any additional questions, you can just pop me some questions over there. But more importantly, I've got a specific Excel spreadsheet that I can share with you. And this spreadsheet basically plots out the various steps within this process that I'm going to discuss today. And it gives you some form of manageability of these calculations as well, and the data that you have. In other words, it helps you to get to specific results. So it's been pre-set to calculate, as you can see over here within the formula, to calculate the man, what's going on now? To calculate you the values, obviously. So you can just go and make use of that. Oh, what's going on here? There we go. You'll see that this is the veld condition assessment in the form of the ecological index assessment. Here is a combination between the benchmark and the ecological index value. There we've got the Danckwerts equation for carrying capacity estimations. Here we've got the graze, well combined. It's a graze unit method, so it's one of the values that's obviously resulted from the vegetation condition assessment we use in that equation, but I'll just talk later on where do we go and use what value. Then I've got the Beckfall, which is the woody biomass calculation, and then subsequent browser unit calculated as well. And then we've got a stocking structure or a stocking calculation table as well at the end of all things. So I'm just quickly going to run through this. And why I gave you my email is if you want the specific Excel spreadsheet, which is nice to have because it helps you to do the calculations. It even to a certain extent removes having to do the calculations yourself and just entering values, and it gives you a result. So send me an email, and within the email just say, can I please get the veld condition assessment and carrying capacity and stocking estimations Excel spreadsheet. So let's start with things. So we've got the vegetation condition assessment that we went in. When we think from vegetation condition assessment, we think of graze. So the condition, not necessarily of all of the vegetation, we think of the grazing component of the grazing strata. To a certain extent, this might exclude forbs as herbaceous within this layer. Grasses obviously being herbaceous in nature as well. But we can just include that into being of ecological value, similar to an invasive as an example. So you still take recognition of these forbs or herbs species and you add a specific value to those. You do not totally discount them. And like I said, please do remember to go and research on your own these types of techniques and give due recognition to the authors of these techniques and modifications. Now, how do we do this? What do we need? What are the steps for veld condition assessment? So if we think veld condition assessment, and if you've got the Van Oudtshoorn book, we can obviously just page to let's see whether it mentions it in Van Oudtshoorn. I can see that on page 180, there's a transect. So on page 180, there's a transect. Now basically what this, I'm going to draw it out here just for you to maybe follow what exactly this is. Where's my paint? There it is. So we've got specific random sites in accordance to our vegetation classification map that is now regarded as stratified units within our, let's say, universe. So now we go and do random sampling. We've got various sites that we maybe identified within the veld of where we are actually going to do the assessments. The best thing to go and do is to ensure randomization, point on a Google Earth Pro as an example and take down the coordinates and go to these coordinates in the veld and use that as your maybe your one corner of your transect. Or you can just basically work in accordance to a specified rule set as well and say, well, in accordance to this road crossing through this specific unit, I'm going to drive, and each kilometer on this road I'm going to stop and I'm going to walk, and this is assuming that it's the same unit that this road is crossing through. I'm going to walk 200 meters into the veld in a directly westward direction, and exactly on that point of 200 meters from the road is going to be my starting point for my transect. So this is obviously to ensure a form of systematic randomization. Now, what you're basically going to do is you want data, and think 200 points. Let's rather stay with 200 points. I know some of you want to go and use 100 points to make it a bit less labor intensive and time consuming. You will most probably get the same results mostly as you would doing a 200 point, but the methodology usually states that do a 200 point. Now what you're going to do is let's quickly check what we've got here. Okay, that was the road. You walk in 200 meters, and that is your starting point for your transect. Now the transect is just basically your line of gathering data. Now this might be in a specific direction, it might be zigzagging throughout the whole place. Maybe you are tracking this, that would be best with a GPS tracker, ensuring that the route that you walk and where you go and end is, as an example, a good indication of, and this is now systematic yet again, of being a distance that is, let's say, 200 meters if you went and sampled every 1 meter or 1 step, as an example now. So each one of those would then represent the meter point, a specific sample point that you've got now, that you need to go and collect data. Now this doesn't necessarily have to be a specific distance, this can be the amount of steps that you take as well. So you can just say, well listen, I'm going to walk into a direction randomly and I'm going to take 1 step and point the stick. And this is, you have a stick. If this is the soil, this is you as a person, and you've got a stick in your hand. Now you do 1 step, 2 step, stick, and that you do randomly without subjectively looking at the ground, choosing a specific species. Do this randomly, look into the sky if you need to, and point on the ground. Now the closest species to that, and this is now a grass or a forb species to that, you are going to then obviously record. So we are going to use 30 centimeter circumference, well rather diameter. Let's say this is 30 centimeters. Now let's make it a radius. So that is 30 centimeters. Closest plant to this point. So if that was your point, the closest plant was over here, and this is a grass, and you're going to record that species. So you're going to say, well, this was, what species is this? And you're going to record this on your form. How does the specific form look like? It's just the normal all ecological index form. If I scroll down, this is usually how it looks. Environmental variables, some of your metadata and secondary data. You go and fill that in your own course, and then you've got species. So you go and record that specific species. If this is the first time that you identified that species within the transect, you write the species. And then the strike would be a tally of the amount of times that you record that species within this transect. So if you do 200 points and you've got that specific species and you had it within 30 centimeters of your point, 50% of the time you'll obviously indicate that on 100 mark tally. Now the thing with regards to strikes is we can also use this to go and determine the plant cover as well. Now what that basically means is we can go and say, well, yes, a strike is just the normal tallying of, so counting of the number of times we encountered the specific species within this transect, but then you can go and add a column here that says misses and hits, or just hits. It doesn't necessarily have to be a miss and a hit. A hit would be when you actually strike the basal part of the plant. So if it's a tufted grass, if you strike the basal part of the plant, so this is how the grass looks like. This is a side view. Here you've got the basal part of the plant. All of this is tillering, extending from there. If you take your stick and your stick hits the basal part of this plant, then record it maybe as a hit. Then you tally up the hits as well, and that might give you an indication of a plant cover percentage that we can go and determine, which might be utilizable in one of the methods or the equations for carrying capacity estimations down the line. So if you poked it next to the plant, that's just a normal miss. Don't even call it a hit or a miss. Obviously, only when it hits, record that as a hit. Now, how this then works, if you tally up all of the hits, just divide that by 2 because you've got 200 specific sampling points or data points. Now, if you divide it by 200, then obviously you get it out of a percentage. And you said, well, I had 20 hits throughout the 200, that means there's a 10% plant coverage that you might use now down the line. If you can just remember this for the sake of one of the equations that we would quickly look at later on for carrying capacity estimation, and that being grazing capacity estimation. All right. You can obviously add up then the total, not of the hits, but of the actual strikes of that plant or the actual accounting of that plant. If it's outside of your 30 centimeters, you just say it's bare ground. If there's just a forb within this area, recorded as a forb. If there's an alien invasive within the area, recorded as an alien invasive. The problem with the alien invasive, even they have got quite a substantial amount of grazing value. So rather just record the species, do not just record it as an alien invasive, and you can go and work grazing capacity off of that. So this is now when it becomes to get quite technical. Let's not go into too much technicalities just now, and that is for later on if need arise. Okay, so now we've got this specific form. So let's quickly go back to our Excel spreadsheet. This is just that specific form now that is being used to calculate certain things in accordance to ecological values, specific classes of, and then the amount of frequency, and then we've got a specific resultant value. So where do we get the ecological value? That is a set thing. Please you go and find the author of this yourself. It might be in the book of Van Oudsmeren, I'm not completely sure. All of this, the categorization of the decreases, increases 1, 2, and 3, and then invasives and forbs, etc., you can obviously find as being listed within the Van Oudsmeren grasses book as well. He would show you within that book at each and every species there would be an indication of whether it's a decreaser, an increaser, and what type of increaser, and that you go and classify the specific species as. Now then you run to this form and say, well, within that 200 points, and we've got 200 data points, how many times that we get a decrease of species. So you went and you said, well, we had 3 decrease of species, but now we see them as a category, we see them as a group. We add up all of those strikes, or the tally of all of them, and then obviously we've got a result. Now let me just quickly check whether this is correct. So has this been worked out to be 6 times. The unfortunate thing is this just out of 100? There would most probably be an additional column over here that says appearance, the amount of times that one has appeared, and that is now trying to iron out whether you did 100, 200 or 300 point transect. So in this case, if that is 200 points, this is not necessarily the value that we got. This is the amount of that we multiplied by the ecological value, if this makes sense by any means. So if we had 80 of them within a 200 point step point, we multiply that by 10 and we've got 800 as representative. But this obviously needs to be divided by 2 then, because we work to a 200 and we need to work towards a 100%. So all of that is fine. Come on, get away. So all of that should be fine. So increase, we had 20 of them within our sample unit. Times that by the 7, and you can see that obviously this is pre-formatted, so it gives you the specific values. So if you go and chop and change these, or rather those, then these are automatically going to change. Now essentially what happens, you go and add up all of these. Like I said, it's been divided by 2 because it's 200. If it was just 100 point transect, you do not need to go and divide it by 2. You just keep it as such. Please do remember that, it's very important. Now 507 is the VCS score, or the veld condition score that we obtained. In this case it would be 507.5. Now within, as a generalization, usually anything above 600 to 1000 is good. 1000 is obviously perfect. Not that you'll ever find yourself getting 1000 score, and anything below 400 or 399 would be regarded as, well, a bad condition or a bad graze, so that's available. Now this in its own is already data or values that is required for a specific type of calculation that you would go and do the carrying capacity, the ecological carrying capacity, and you use those with the grazer unit method. So if you just check over here, go to the grazer unit method, this is this long algebra calculation with the log 10 in it, and you'll see that you have to go and fill this in at a specific place here within the equation. EI means ecological index, so that is where you put in the value of the ecological index, and that's the one that we just saw now, that one. Now mind you, this is only if you've done one sample unit within a unit, vegetation unit that is. If you've done 50, then you get a mean of that, and that is now representative of the unit itself. If you said, well, I'm not going to work in accordance to a stratification, I'm just going to do simple random sampling within the whole farm of mine. Then if you've got 100, then you work towards a mean for the whole farm area. Hopefully that makes sense. I'll show you quickly just now how you can go determine the benchmark, which is the next part, and a different type of equation that you can do as well. So this is to be more specific and have relevance to anything outside of what we would presume good quality veld to be. I mean, if you go, let's say, to the Karoo or to Fynbos Vegetation, and you go and do this 200 point step point within a single unit, and you step and you see afterwards that, okay, I only got 10 recordings of grasses within my transect. This is a problem. Does that then mean that the vegetation condition is bad? No, it's not, because I mean the vegetation is predominantly maybe shrubland, as an example. We just want to take note of the graze component available and then stock in accordance to that. So it's not necessarily that we now say that this is bad. So that is when we rather go and make use of not the VCA or the VCS score to read it into the grazer unit method. We rather go and try and adopt this and say, well, listen, let's work to what should be seen as a good type of veld, and that is now the type of benchmark with regards to the grazing component within this vegetation type that I have, or within this biome that I have. So now you make it more specific to the type of vegetation instead of generalizing. So that's when you would rather go and maybe make use of the benchmark, because now you go and identify what needs to be considered a decent type of condition for veld in that area. So how do you do that? So still go and do your 50, let's say, normal sample units for step points. So 50 times maybe, and this is now exaggerating, but I mean this really depends on the time you spend on this, the accuracy you want on this. I mean, if it's for a specific assignment within your diploma or your course, your lecturer or your supervisor is most probably going to say, well, it's fine if you only do 2 or 3 or 4 sample units within each vegetation unit, or 4, 5 or 6 within the total universum that you're going to try and stock at the end of the day. But let's say we did 50 of these step points now. So 50 times 200, 50 times transects, in other words. Now you've got 50 different forms that you filled in. The forms being obviously this one. You've got 50 of these. That's now representative each of a sample unit. Now to get the benchmark, you go and choose the one that had the highest VCS or the VCA score out of those. So then you run to a table like this. So you've got the homogeneous unit name, you gave it your specific names, you've got the various sample plots or sample units, I also call them, that you did. In this case, we had a vegetation community, which is a homogeneous unit, and we had 4 sample units. So we did 4 times 200 point transects. For each one of those, we've got resultant values, VCA values. And now we've got a benchmark value. And how is that? We went in accordance to our list over here. And we said, well, okay, this was the best. So we regard this as being the best condition for that specific type of veld or that specific community. And we use that as our benchmark. Now, I mean, this might supersede other years as well, or other years rather would supersede maybe this figure. So if you know for that specific unit 5 years back you got a ecological index value of 90, still use 90 because that's still the benchmark. In this case it was maybe a pioneering assessment, so you would then just go and choose the highest one with regards to the ecological index value. as your benchmark value. Now, go and take all of these ecological index values of the VCA values, VCA scores that you got, and you work it out as a percentage of the benchmark. So obviously this one would be at 100%. The 70.2 would be 95.51% of 73.5, and obviously down the line as well. And then you work on averages. So the ecological index average was 70.88, that's all of those. And benchmark average was 96.43, and that's a mean off of all of those. So now you see the big difference between the two. Because initially with the ecological index, only doing the ecological index, it would say, well, listen, the veld is, it's at 70%. But if you go and benchmark it to the specific best condition veld within that specific region or that veld type or community, then all of a sudden it says, well, off of that, it's actually not bad at all. There's only a little bit of improvement that can still occur to ensure that everything is to that benchmark. So you go and set a standard yourself. So if you do it within fynbos or Karoo vegetation or anywhere outside of, let's say, grasslands and savanna, basically, rather go and try and use a benchmark instead of using just a standardized ecological index. All right, so now we've got both of these values maybe. Are we going to use both of them? I just told you, well, where would you rather go and make use of them? So I'm going to stop this video here. Let me just quickly see whether there's anything additional that we need. On page 181 of the Van Oudtshoorn Principles and Practices book, you can find that there's a 100-point transect or survey that has been done. It gives you a bit of a different type of variables that needs to be entered to those that I gave you. But I mean, go for that as well. You're going to get exactly the same result. So yet again, there's variations off of this. The nice thing about that is it gives you the additional hits and percentages of hits to work out percentage cover as well. Okay, let me just quickly go through this document to see if we missed anything. We've got we've got everything. Okay, so that's the end of this first video on the veld assessment. So after this one, I would go and do the ecological carrying capacities for both browse and graze.